go. Okay. Thank you all so much for joining us for part 1 of the Sustainable Buildings for All webinar series that's hosted by DEQ. My name is Amanda Meyer. I am an architect and senior policy analyst in the materials management program at DEQ, where I co-lead our built environment work. And I'll turn it over to Ante to introduce himself as well.
Thanks, Amanda. I'm Ante Vullen, a sustainability consultant based in Portland with GluMac, and very excited to share what Amanda and I have been working on for the past couple of years.
Awesome, thanks, Ante. So yeah, so just housekeeping, as I mentioned, we are recording this webinar so that folks have access to it after the fact, as well as for folks who can't attend live. And also, we do have the chat and Q&A working now, so please feel free to drop questions in there along the way. And as we go through, if Ante and I see any that are really relevant to the point that we're talking about at the moment, we'll ask those live. But we'll also be saving any others till the end and do a more robust Q&A session at the end as well. So with that, I'll do a little intro here. So the Sustainable Buildings for All framework, as well as the report and a summary document, were published earlier this year, and we will drop a link in the chat to those. The Sustainable Buildings for All framework was developed by a coalition of sustainability and equity experts and advocates with the goal of incentivizing and therefore accelerating the development of building projects in their communities. And these projects specifically that achieve high levels of environmental performance, social equity, and human and environmental health. And I also just want to touch on a couple of things of what SB4A is and what it isn't. So what it is not is any sort of statewide program or mandate that has been adopted by any local governments to date. But what it is a template that can be adapted and used by local governments in order to help incentivize more of these projects in their communities. So just want to help clarify that kind of right off the bat, is this is really a template and a place for hopefully for people to start from. And I also just want to acknowledge the many people who served on the leadership team, the steering committee, and as contributing partners in developing the SB4A framework and report. And so a lot of people dedicating and spending their free time over a lot of years. So thank you to everyone. And so just to open here, we wanted to start with why the built environment, why we're talking about the built environment as one of these strategies. And it has huge impacts, as many of you know, but just to touch on a handful of them. Of course, the climate crisis. Buildings account for 28% of Oregon's consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions. 20% of that is from the operation of buildings, and another 8% is from the production of the materials that go into the buildings, or what we sometimes call embodied carbon. And Ante will talk about this in a little more detail relative to the framework in a bit. We also look at it from a health perspective, and of course there's more than just the toxics, but one we want to highlight here is that it affects human health through exposure to toxics in building materials. So the red list is one industry standard for materials and chemicals of concern that really should be avoided in building projects because they have significant human and environmental health impacts, such as some of those that you see on the screen here, as well as others. So they are carcinogens, damage to wildlife, endocrine, developmental and reproductive toxicants, just a lot of really concerning health impacts from the materials and chemicals on the red list. In addition, the built environment has played and continues to play a role in the structural inequities that exacerbate the burdens of the climate crisis, of health impacts, of environmental justice, and also of economic opportunities. So again, one example, systemic injustices like redlining that have led to disproportionate impacts like disinvestment, like what we see here in this research from Portland State University that shows how a lack of investment in green infrastructure in formerly redlined neighborhoods has led to a disparity in exposure to higher temperatures that are associated with urban heat islands. And this is compared to adjacent non-redlined neighborhoods. We also see it through displacements, the concentration specifically of forced displacement in formerly redlined neighborhoods, and how these have contributed to disparities in health and wealth that are still felt today. And forced displacement, specifically in Portland's Albina neighborhood, has led to significant decline in the number of Black Portlanders that are still residing in this historic cultural center, from 80% in the 60s to about 20% today. And these are huge impacts, and there's more. And so that is why we are focused on how the built environment and specifically a framework like this can help address some of these issues for Oregon and for Oregon's local governments. So just a little bit of history about the initiative. It really began as an idea back in 2017 because of this project on the screen, which is by Aegis Living and Anchor Moisen Architects, and went through the Seattle Living Building pilot program. And at the time, I was the project architect for this project and really saw the opportunity for an incentive program, of course, Seattle's Living Building pilot program, to move a code baseline building to become the first senior housing living building in the world. And so Seattle's program offers height and floor area ratio bonuses, zoning code exceptions, priority permitting, and municipal assistance. And we will cover all of this about this program in much more detail in part 2 of the webinar, which is next Monday, where we'll hear from Jess Harris, who runs this program at City of Portland, or City of Seattle, in addition to others. And then also from Paul Roman with Arlington County, Virginia, where they will both share more about the lessons learned and takeaways from their programs. But I just want to touch on how a few of these incentives were really critical to the success of this project on the screen. One was the zoning bonuses. The height and FAR bonuses meant that the client could put an extra floor on the building, which really helped the developer meet their pro forma and help pay for some of the upgrades that otherwise they weren't typically including in their development projects. Another was the zoning code departures, in particular for this project, parking access, which typically needed to occur on a side street, which you see here, there was an 18% grade. So by the time you get far enough from the corner to actually create a curb cut, you were between the second and third floor for parking. And whether you were parking at that level or ramping down to the below grade, this project lost 2 full floors of units to make that work. And so being able to have parking access on this main thoroughfare because of the allowances through the Living Building pilot program, this project penciled when it otherwise might not have. And then, of course, really importantly was the municipal assistance that Jess offers, helping to kind of move these projects through the review process at City of Portland and helping zoning code reviewers understand what might be different about these projects compared to their usual review process. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ante.
Thanks, Amanda. So yes, the genesis of what we're talking about today was Oregonians looking at something happening in Seattle and wanting to do better. That's the spirit of competition. And so, but we are way behind them in a lot of ways. The City of Seattle's the various iterations of this program have been around for a while, gradually increasing adoption. We love to see the iteration of this. It's changed over these years in response to the market and in response to the City of Seattle's policies. And this plot only runs through 2020, but in my professional work, we continue to see developer interest in this program, and we want to see something like that in Oregon. Was the original motivation for this. Now in Oregon, we have a slightly different context. So one thing that differs from Washington is we didn't really have any ability to go out and pursue a code-based solution, despite, we felt like it was in line with what the city of Portland might want. It was a lot more complicated. And so what we did have, even if we didn't have that clear pathway, was a lot of smart people and a lot of people we could listen to for their perspective. And as Amanda mentioned, there's a lot of people working on projects outside of Portland who are in Portland and know how to make deeply sustainable buildings. So from that perspective, what we thought would be a better pathway was following that Seattle method of doing it incentives. And as Amanda mentioned, the zoning code is a huge part of that, and that's a little bit more locally controlled. And what we thought would really help make this work is helping to really explicitly tie this building policy to the climate and equity goals that our community has, and that your community probably has as well. Bear with me. But we wanted to do something because we're locally proud people, is try to do something that was the Oregon version. And one thing that jumped out at us just through our work and our status as citizens in our communities, we wanted to see something done with equity. Amanda mentioned all these historic changes in Portland, and as someone who's been born in Portland and raised in Portland, it gets that rate of change if it was only accelerating, really. And so we wanted to find something that was going to speak to those outside of what some of the green building rating systems were doing. Additionally, we wanted to have this be an inclusive process. We acknowledge our own blind spots about so many things, and we found more blind spots as this went on. So Amanda showed you that list of people we worked with. That's not that's not everyone who needs to be consulted in this. And as you think about how something like this might work in your community, I'm sure there's a long list of people you would want to talk to. And then the other thing that motivated this was wanting to beat that curve in Seattle, to really find a faster trajectory. And so you can say, and we'll show some of these projects later, there are some really sustainable buildings that have been built in Portland, and we think that's great. It's awesome that they did that without an incentive, but we want to have more of them, and we think incentives might be an important way to get there. So with that said, let's talk about what SB4A, or Sustainable Buildings for All, has turned into. The first things I want to emphasize are three key principles. Is that this is a framework. It's not done. It was developed by one group, and that's definitely not always the best way to make any kind of policy. And so we see it as something that can be built upon by government employees, by local communities, by other parts of the design and construction community. It's just a framework. The second part is that we're really pushing this as voluntary. This may inspire you for some new form of code or regulation, but that's not how it was intended. It's designed to motivate the people who want to do these things and incentivize them for that. And so there's not any necessarily a really strict cost effectiveness. It's not like we can say that doing this would save so many dollars in energy or things like that. It wasn't designed in that way like some other standards or codes are. It's also a pilot. It's explicitly influenced by the city of Seattle and their willingness to iterate through their living building pilot program. So we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good, but we do want everything we do to have an impact. And so the goal is that or anyone who is deploying something similar would iterate this and kind of when they design their own deployment of it, have those feedback mechanisms in place. And it is organized around three big goals: climate action, equity and racial justice, and then health of humans and the environment. And I think Amanda did a great walkthrough of why those are so important locally. And I think in your community, you may find similar stories. But what we connected to was just whatever we were going to do, we needed to show that it was going to move the needle in these three areas. And it's not happening in a vacuum. There's all these other actions taken at the state level that often explicitly address those three goals. Some of you may be more or less familiar with these, but there are initiatives that are going on that people are working on to help come to reality. And so we knew whatever we were doing, it needed to exist in that same ecosystem. We went through things locally in Portland that also aligned with it, and your community may have a different set, but what we see is that the time is right, and it's up to the building industry to start making their contribution for all the reasons Amanda identified about the heavy environmental impact. So this process has been going on for a number of years. There was I think it might have been 2018 where the International Living Future Institute released what's called like a model ordinance if you wanted to do a living building incentive in your community. So why didn't we just do that? Part of it was our commitment to the equity side of it, and then also just trying to understand what would really work locally. So some of the things, that we have heard and had or suggested is that we want this to open to a range of building types. What works for a commercial office building may not work for a multifamily building, or what works for an owner occupied healthcare building will be different than what could work for other models of development. So we wanted to find something that was expansive enough that it didn't exclude typologies. We also, to do that, people told us we're going to need a range of options to comply so that people weren't getting kicked out. And so what you'll see is we've set up a tiered system that gives entry points for a lot of different project types. The other thing we heard is that other incentives are really needed. There's a lot of challenges about applying things like additional floors to projects because sometimes that costs more to build an extra floor in a way that changes the economics of a project. But there's still always, building projects always could use more help to get off the ground. And so two things that came up, we heard the most, were something that was not a direct, cash infusion, but could kind of show up like a cash infusion, something that saved costs. So a system development charge, a fee paid by a developer based on the impact of a project to municipal systems, waiving that or deferring it or doing something to mitigate that cost was very popular when we talked to developers. And another one was some kind of permit assisting or priority, whether that meant helping you do something new or innovative, or sometimes just helping you get through the queue faster, which has an impact on your project. The other thing that we heard when we talked to cities was how we don't want to be inventing a new program that's putting a burden on staff, that's eating up staff resources. And so that's why we're really heavily motivated by third-party certifications as a tool to kind of outsource that, and it takes the burden off of the city, because city government has many competing priorities, and while this is impactful, we don't want to be taking away from their other goals. And then I think the other obstacle, biggest one you heard, was just equity. It could range from cynicism about some of these green building standards to just a commitment to wanting to do better. But how can we find a way to get this involved that doesn't rule out all these previous issues we just talked to? And our process commitment was to have a subcommittee focused on developing that equity specific requirements and being able to push back on people who said, oh, you can't find that many minority subcontractors, or we could never do outreach like that to the community. But that was something we wanted to really build into this to help make it meaningful and to help ultimately that it would support the goals of the communities that we live in. So we ended up with 4 tiers, which I think actually probably started out with 3, and then based on feedback, got a 4th tier. And across those tiers, there's requirements. They're really broken out by different levels of performance under third-party certifications, and then adding in some equity-specific additional requirements. And the goal was that when we couldn't take something off the shelf, like a third-party rating system, that we were going to find a impactful yet relatively straightforward to recognize and document equity requirement that would go with this. And again, that's something where we probably knew the least going in. And so we think there's a huge opportunity for improvement or innovation in other communities. The tier 1, the lower numbers, are the higher performing tier. And as we get into some example projects that are built in Portland and the state, there are projects at all of these tiers that exist today. So it's not a moonshot by any means. And then along with those improved performance across a range of factors, we want to increase incentives so that we get more buildings at a higher level of performance. So that's the basic structure, the goals, why this is set up the way it is. And now we're going to talk through in a little bit more details what that means. So I've said the word third-party certifications a lot, and you may or may not be familiar with those, but in the green building ecosystem, we like third-party certifications because they present an objective perspective on how a building is performing against a range of environmental factors. That's largely consensus driven or industry consensus driven, and they help us a lot in the building industry because they clearly communicate sometimes the goals we're trying to achieve. They allow for comparison between buildings, and they allow the industry as a whole to focus on specific areas. And most of these certifications are really heavily weighted towards energy, water, these metrics driven reductions, but they vary in terms of how they address other things like transportation and location. And especially one thing that's deficient is we didn't love how any of them got into equity. But we like using them ultimately because project teams are able to respond to these clear performance targets, and that it takes that burden off of a city of having to develop their own metrics or guides for this. We have a whole other webinar where we'll get more into this and how they work and what they can mean for policy. But they're the foundation of assessing the traditional environmental performance of buildings for this effort. Now, we looked at a lot of rating systems for this. These are the columns here of Fitwel, FIAS or Passive House, US, LEED Zero Energy and Zero Carbon, Earth Advantage, the LEED for new construction rating system, Core rating system, which is a version of the Living Building Challenge that's been stripped down, Living Building Challenge Pedal, which is a really issue focused area of the Living Building Challenge, and then the full Living Building Challenge living status. As I said, we'll get into these more, but they all have different ways in which they address some of the key issues that mattered to us on this in those kind of three macro categories at the left. They vary a lot in what's based on just a design or actual performance and verification. So we wanted to figure out which of these would align the most and make sense as part of this framework. So our highest tier is tier 1 is the Living Building Challenge living certification. We don't have time to get into everything that a living building does, but it's intended to be a net zero energy building verified by actual performance. It's supposed to use significantly less water and manage its wastewater through sustainable means. It's supposed to divert construction waste from landfill at a very high percentage factor, and it's supposed to use healthy and locally sourced materials. From a building perspective, this is widely considered the highest tier of performance for a new building. But we know that's a very small subset. There's maybe only 70 of these buildings around the world right now. And we have one of them in Portland, but we want to make sure there's other points of entry into this. And so we look at some other projects or other levels going down. At the second tier, you may not be getting through every single requirement of the Living Building Challenge. So you're just doing a subset. This is called pedal certification. And we've seen some projects locally be able to achieve this. And then it also says you can do that, but we also need to know that you're committing to some form of zero energy through the ILFI Zero Carbon program. Or you could do the core Living Building Challenge version, which is 10 key imperatives to follow through. Again, just a huge jump in performance over a typical building, but not going quite as far. So at tier 3 and then at tier 4, we're getting into LEED and Earth Advantage certifications that are more common in the market, and setting some goals too of connecting those design focused standards on some actual verified performance levels. So that's really important to us, is that we're not missing out on some of the really important climate factors. But as we'll talk about in a second, there are projects at all of these tiers in the local market. If you needed a screenshot slide about what this means for climate, we also wanted to look at not just operational energy, but embodied carbon. So operational energy is what you're getting charged for by the utility, and we want to reduce that through deploying renewables. At a smaller scale, at the lowest tier, we just want to show that you're locking in efficiency. And those can be ambitious targets for say an affordable housing project to hit, but we think there's precedent for getting there. But we really wanted to make sure we locked in some level of operational energy and climate performance. The other aspect of this is embodied carbon. So Amanda called out the impacts of building material manufacturing. And I think there's a lot of attention being paid to how we can reduce that impact through, say, using engineered wood products instead of concrete or steel. Definitely a hot issue locally. There's a great PCC workforce training building going up that you can still see the CLT and glulam structure in Northeast Portland if you're out and about. But the idea is that it's still relatively new for individual projects to address. So we said at tier 4, okay, maybe you don't have the ability to analyze this right now. We're going to give you an option to still be in the program without that. But at higher levels, if you have a more sophisticated team or a team that just is committed to learning how to do this, we want to see that you can show how you've reduced the embodied carbon of your building by, say, using smarter concrete mixes, something the city of Portland is already trying to do in its own projects, and then setting a higher threshold kind of in line with industry levels of performance. And at that tier 1 level, building on what's in the Living Building Challenge, you need to account for all the embodied carbon, the carbon footprint of your building structure enclosure, and offset it. So this is how we show our commitment to real impactful climate impact. So we mentioned case studies and across those tiers. So one that's the city of Portland should be very excited about is the PAE Living Building. Located in a historic neighborhood, this project is on track to be a full living building, which means it's a net zero energy building. And that means it's meeting the city's renewable energy target at the building scale 30 years ahead of schedule. It's a really spectacular building, one that basically was designed and constructed in the time that we've been developing this. And these are exactly the kind of buildings we want to see more of in Portland. This project is the Meyer Memorial Trust, the headquarters of one of Oregon's largest, if not the largest, charitable foundations. This is a project that took equity very seriously. It's located specifically to serve a community that had been challenged by displacement and gentrification. It took its sourcing of materials extremely seriously, sourcing a lot of sustainably harvested wood from around the state of Oregon, including from small or minority landowners. And it has very high energy performance. We'll put the numbers on screen. It's on path for net zero. It's not completely net zero, just it doesn't have quite enough solar, but it's a very high performing LEED Platinum building that was constructed without an incentive. And we think they would have been able to fit into tier 3 or a higher tier with really minimal changes. At a different scale, we have the Tillamook Row housing development, actually located not too far from the Meyer Memorial Trust project. This is a housing project that is targeting net zero energy. With smart design, we have a really good chance of making that at this building scale in our climate. And so now we have a project that's adding on to not just our housing need, but also doing it in a way that aligns with those long-term climate goals. And if you look around the state, there are more examples of this, particularly at this kind of residential scale. So the people are out there, they're designing these projects, they're building these projects, but we need more of them. And so with that, I will let Amanda take it back and talk through some of the equity aspects of this.
Thanks, Ante. And before I jump, we do have a question in the chat from Jess that I think we should touch on while we're in this section, asking the percentage reductions relative to operational energy and embodied carbon are from what baseline, whether they're ASHRAE or Oregon code. And I'll move us back to that slide real quick so we can look at it. And I'll just say it's a mix, but Ante, I don't know if you want to dive into those more deeply. I know Earth Advantage is from code. That is how the Earth Advantage certification is structured. And tier 2 through 4 with LEED and LBC is from a modeled baseline. Take it away, Ante.
Yeah, mostly from ASHRAE. And so if Oregon is just, rolling out its new energy code. So we're now actually probably several ASHRAE cycles ahead in our energy code of what the LEED baseline is. And I think what's exciting about that is it starts to shrink that incremental cost to get to these tiers versus just complying with code. And I think what we will increasingly see is that people will say, oh, the in-building efficiency stuff, we have to do that for lead. That's not as, or sorry, we have to do that for code. It's not as big of an obstacle. And what will allow projects teams to do is start thinking about, okay, we're doing this inside the building. We know how to do that, but what's our renewable strategy? Thinking about incorporating the on-site or off-site renewable purchasing. And there is a report that includes all the really fun details that I think Amanda has posted into the chat that is for your pleasure reading after this. But that's a great question.
Yeah, thank you for that. Great. So I'm going to jump in here to talk about the additional equity and racial justice requirements. And what Ante has mentioned, our subcommittee that really focused on this effort, because while some of these are covered in some of the existing third-party certifications, there was definitely a desire from the folks we were speaking to just be more intentional about how these showed up, specifically to some of the needs we identified in Oregon, and also kind of above and beyond where we have the capacity to do that. And so they were organized into 3 major areas. So workforce and contract development, inclusion, and community engagement. And so just starting at the top here with the workforce and contract development, we're starting with COBID. And for those who aren't familiar, COBID is the Certification Office for Business Inclusion and Diversity, which registers minority-owned, women-owned, service-disabled, veteran-owned, and emerging small businesses. And so what we've done in the tiers is start from a 10%, which is really achievable in the market, to kind of move that requirement up as we move up the tiers. And what that is a minimum percentage of design and construction contracts that must be held by COBID firms. And what else was really highlighted by some of the steering committee members is that there's definitely an underrepresentation of people of color and women in the industry right now. And also that right now, a significant majority of COBID registered firms are white. And so the folks on the committee really wanted to make sure that we were setting some additional requirements that made sure that women and minority-owned hiring percentages were applied in addition to these minimum requirements. So you'll see that in the second line here, that at least 1/4 of these of the figure that you see above must be minority-owned, and 1/4 must be minority and/or women-owned. So really trying to acknowledge where we still kind of have some discrepancies in some of our existing programs and structures. And then as we move into inclusion, there were really 2 parts to this. The first was that the project should include public space and/or art. So this really being a place that any of these buildings are really welcoming to the public, and we don't have spaces that are inaccessible. And then moving beyond that to affordable rents. And we looked at this from both residential, but also commercial. And so these start in tier 3, and again, increase as we move up the tiers. And for the residential side of things, this was really aligned with the City of Portland's inclusionary housing requirements. So the certain number of units available at or below 80% median family income, or also an alternative pathway at or below 60%. And then on the commercial side, this was defined to align with Prosper Portland's affordable commercial tenanting program. And this was set at a minimum percentage of rentable commercial area that must be available at 10% below market rate. And then last was,
Amanda, as you kick off this next section, we did get a great question in the chat, echoing something you heard before, is what is community? What is the definition of that?
Yes, that is a question that comes up a lot. And that is something that as a committee, we chose not to define. because we were putting this out kind of as a framework. And so what we understand is that each local jurisdiction is going to need to look at this from their own needs and what's available kind of in their local and regional markets. And so we didn't want to be too prescriptive in how this was defined or what this meant for folks. So even the percentages that I'm talking about and kind of how those align here with a couple of programs that are Portland based, those are suggestions based on kind of current best data where a number of the steering committee members were located, but we also understand that those may need to shift as local governments look at this framework and adapt it to their own areas. So thank you for that question. It's a really important one. That community can really be defined a lot of ways, and we want to make sure that folks are able to do that as is relevant to their own local and regional spaces. And so looking at the community engagement piece relative to that very question, we decided to keep the requirements the same across the tiers, except that the role of community in a project, in project decision making increases from starting at tier 4 from informing to actively engaged in tier 3, to involved in decision making in tier 2, and then in tier 1 really driving and or leading the project. And specific requirements that are outlined in more detail in the report around community meetings that are required, information that should be shared with community, accessibility of the meetings, and also the meeting materials. So whether that's language or timing or services provided or compensation. And then also that the design strategy must address displacement and disproportionate environmental impacts. And then ultimately at the end, a project team must submit a report that demonstrates this compliance. And so this is one of the areas where we acknowledge that because there isn't a third-party verification for some of these requirements, there is going to be sort of that determining how that review happens. And here, looking at the idea of submitting a report, that felt for us like it still aligned with some of the reporting mechanisms for third-party certifications. You know, thinking of the biophilic design requirements in ILFI's Living Building Challenge. Some of these things are subjective, and so really finding ways for each local jurisdiction to make sure that they're meeting their needs and those requirements are being met. But again, we didn't want to get super prescriptive in that because we understand that everyone is going to need to do that in a different way. So I also want to touch on a few case studies relative to the equity requirements. Starting here with Las Adelitas, which is an affordable housing project that's currently under construction in the Coley neighborhood in Portland. And it is 142 affordable apartments with 18 permanent supportive housing units. From public space perspective, there's a community room, a community hall, a public plaza, and also mural art. And the community design process was really extensive, led by Living Coley, by Verde, and by Salazar Architect. And they really hosted a lot of hands-on workshops with immigrant Latinx and African Muslim families that live in the Coley area, as well as open houses with neighborhood residents and allied organizations. So this is one example of how this project specifically defined community, just based on who they were serving and who was in the surrounding area. And then also this project then took the culturally specific input that they received, and it helped guide the design of the apartments, the community hall, the public plaza, and the streetscape. Also, Meyer Memorial Trust, we heard a bit about this earlier from Ante, as really a project that is recognized for both sustainability and equity. So this project set out with a guiding principle to address historic inequities in Portland. And a few ways that they did this, they actually raised their offices onto the upper floors of the building so that the ground floor could really serve as community engagement space. They also had a rotating art collection that embraces diverse artists and generations from around the state, as well as custom pieces that are under commission from people of color and Indigenous artists. And as a part of this art program, they partnered with King's School Museum of Contemporary Art, which is organized by both the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary and Harriet Tubman Middle School that are nearby, and really worked with that program in establishing what this art program was at their headquarters. And then from a contracting standpoint, 47% of construction contracts were held by minority and or women-owned businesses, which kind of looking back at the tiers that we laid out is a tier 1 level of performance. And then also there's the Richmond Residence, which is a zero energy and zero water single family home in Portland. And this project didn't meet tier 3 of the COVID contracting requirements, which is 20%. But what this project also helped the committee understand is what the approach should be for the equity requirements for specifically owner occupied single family homes. And so some of the alternative pathways here that were identified is that no public space or art requirements would apply to owner-occupied single-family homes, and also that there would be no affordable rents requirement because, again, they're owner-occupied. And then the community engagement requirement is just shifted. So instead of the varying levels that we talked about earlier, all tiers state that the project is required to inform the community about this project. And so that is the baseline requirement for owner-occupied single-family homes. And so now I just want to touch on kind of some of the incentives that were outlined in the framework, which we've talked about a little bit in the past, but these really reflect the input from many interested parties collected over multiple years of the initiative. And then, as Ante mentioned earlier, are structured to provide larger incentives to higher performing tiers. So in the top 2 rows, you see those zoning bonuses that include the floor area ratio or FAR bonus, as well as the height bonus. And in the next 2 rows, specifically the next row I'll start with is the systems development charges that Ante mentioned earlier. And in tier 1, which is the full living building challenge, because those projects are operating at 0 of pretty much all categories, we thought that it made sense to waive all SDC charges for those projects. And because tiers 2 through 4 are operating at kind of different levels of performance, this one was written as prorating those waivers that are specifically associated with where those reductions might happen, so sewer and water, and then also deferring the payment of other SDC charges. And again, that was because we heard so much that a huge part of the lift here for project teams is reducing that upfront soft costs so that they can, in their pro forma, justify some of these higher performance systems or materials that they might not usually use in some of these projects. And so this is one way that we're helping to kind of defer those costs to later down the line. And then also really importantly, what projects across all scales, all types, all locations, all ownership models really highlighted was, in addition to the SDC charges, the other thing that would help the upfront costs was municipal assistance. And I mentioned earlier in the Aegis living example, how much that impacted the project that we had Jess at the City of Seattle, who was really there to help shepherd our project through. And so we made that a kind of across the board here. And then in tiers 1 and 2 added the priority design review and permitting as kind of that step up. And then also across all of the tiers, we noted the additional zoning code exceptions and being more specific about that help result in a development that better meets the goals of the certification that's being pursued, but does not conflict with applicable design guidelines. And that was a lesson learned from Seattle's program. But just acknowledging that these projects sometimes have different needs from others because of their high performance. So one example might be a pretty extensive solar panel array on the top of a building that maybe needs to encroach in a right of way, and kind of giving some allowances to a project to allow some of those design choices. And then also penalties. So again, learning from Seattle's program, you can't take back incentives like FAR and height bonuses once a project is built. So that framework proposed a penalty structure that we adapted as well. So up to 5% of total construction value. And then specifically these figures below as kind of a guideline for projects. A minimum of 1.5% penalty for any non-compliance. Additional 1% penalties if the non-compliance is to the carbon or equity requirements. Another 0.5 for any other non-compliance. And then if it's really significant, the project team just actually didn't pursue what it is they said they were going to do, then that additional 1% on top of that. And so just to close out here with some of the closing thoughts that we've had through this process, through the folks that have partnered with us to develop this framework, is there's really a lot of market interest in addressing the goals that were outlined: sustainability, equity, or health. But SB4A really wants to move the market so that projects are addressing all of these critical issues in clear and measurable ways, which really helps local governments understand how these projects are contributing to your local goals that you may have set. Also, we found that many projects are already performing at or near the tiers of SB4A. And we wouldn't say that's like the market is performing there, but we showed a handful of projects, and there are some others as well, that are showing that this can be done without incentives. What we want to do is see the incentives help bring more of that market to the table in order to see more projects performing at this level, or for projects who are performing at a certain tier, that we see them start to work their way up those tiers as well. And so we see incentive frameworks like this can be a nudge, but also want to acknowledge that they cannot address these issues alone. And so multiple complementary policies and programs are necessary. So Ante mentioned things like building codes. Of course, that will have a big impact. And we've also noted some others throughout the report as well that we're happy to talk about. And so before we close out here, I also just want to remind folks of the remaining webinar schedule, because this is just overview of the project, of the framework, of how it's structured, what it is, what it isn't. But we are going to be doing some deeper dives. So in part 2 on Monday, as I mentioned, we'll be looking at some of the model frameworks that helped inspire and teach the lessons that they learned to our committee as they developed this framework. In part 3, we'll take a deeper dive into the certifications that Ante covered at a high level here today. And then in part 4, we'll dive a little bit deeper into some of the case studies that we mentioned here and that are included in the report as well. So with that, yeah, just a big thank you to everyone who attended, and happy to take more questions at the time we have remaining. I do see one, Ante, that says, I think you confirmed this earlier, but sounds like no jurisdictions have adopted this or something like this formally. Is that correct? Do you know if any jurisdictions are in the process of using this as a template? Yes, you are correct. No one has adopted this formally. There are a number of jurisdictions who have expressed interest, who we've been talking to, and also some of whom requested this webinar series so that the information is more accessible to more of their staff who maybe don't want to read a really big report. So, so yes and yes to your question. There are some folks who are looking into this.
And there are, as mentioned, other jurisdictions have similar or different, other versions of incentives as well. And then Amanda, is this going to be, I know we said the recording's available. Will the slides be with it?
Yes, they can be. We can certainly do that. Yes, and that was a really good point, Ante, is to acknowledge some of the ways that jurisdictions are doing some of this already, and other programs like Energy Trust of Oregon. And so, the stacking of all of these complementary programs is really the goal here, to keep moving the needle forward. Okay. I see more in the chat. What is the best way to get involved with the SB4A framework? Yes, very, very good question. From a DEQ perspective, our role was really as like convener, as well as to kind of create a platform to publish this incentive. And so as far as moving forward, our role is really as technical advisors, if we can offer support, answer questions, connect folks to all of the brilliant people who contributed to this work. That is something we're definitely interested in helping folks navigate. And other folks who are really interested in seeing something like this in their jurisdiction, definitely share that with your local government staff, and let them know that this is something that may be useful to you, whether you're a developer or a designer or an interested community member. Yes, any of those things, anytime you want to share this, as well as suggestions you may have that help this be more specific to your local community than maybe what you see up here is also really helpful. Ante, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, please do.
No, I think you summed it up quite well.
Okay, and I'm scrolling. Make sure we don't miss anybody. But I think we got it all. And I'll also just note, you have both of our emails now on the screen, and we'll also send out a follow-up with links to where all of this lives, and you can reach out at any time with any questions too, if you'd like to dive a little deeper. And we hope to see you at the next 3 parts. Right. Sounds good. Well, thanks everyone.